Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover two primary topics. One of them, the first one, is the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime, and the specifics of the terrorist attack and ambush on the 3 police officers that were murdered by the regime in Artsakh last weekend. And then we're going to move on to study the very interesting economic growth numbers that were announced at the end of last year. We'll start with a briefing on the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh. And it's actually a long, convoluted process and storyline that we all went through this week. So I'm going to start off with briefing everyone about a conversation and a meeting that was held between the representatives of the Republic of Artsakh and regime agents. This was a meeting that was mediated by Russian peacekeepers. Within this meeting, what was discussed was opening of the illegally closed road, a one-time inspection by the Aliyev regime of the 2 primary mines in Artsakh, the installment of a Russian-controlled X-ray checkpoint to check cargo going in and out of Artsakh, and to ensure the uninterrupted electricity and gas flow from the Armenian Republic into the Artsakh Republic. After that initial report of what was discussed in the meeting on this Monday, the president of Artsakh, in a Security Council meeting, Areg Harutyunyan, stated that this was not the only thing that was discussed, which in fact the response of the Aliyev regime was not just discussing these facts, was that their demand that they're demanding integration. And if they threaten that if they don't get integration of Artsakh, the Artsakh Republic with Aliyev state, nothing will go back to normal. And in fact, they went on to threaten further aggressions against the Artsakh Republic. Now let's sit back and understand what integration means in the context of the Aliyev regime. Integration is a pretty word for ethnic cleansing and nothing else. Let's be very clear. Any negotiations between the Artsakh Republic and the Aliyev regime that is not within the context of an internationally controlled negotiating process that is supervised by different world powers that will go ahead and guarantee the safety and security of the residents of Artsakh, and a security that is not simply guaranteed by the unreliable Russian peacekeepers, is either going to lead to war or ethnic cleansing. Because in the context of one-on-one negotiations, the regime's logic of negotiations is if you do not do what we want, we will simply attack you, murder your police officers, or starve your civilians. You know, in history, there have been other regimes and people who like to negotiate in this style, and we all know where that leads to. To me, this guy comes to mind.
Jeder hat mich belogen, sogar die SS. Die gesamte Generalität ist nichts weiter als ein Haufen niederträchtiger, treuloser Feiglinge!
Mein Führer, ich kann nicht zulassen, dass die Soldaten, die für Sie verbringen...
Nicht als Feiglinge! Verreiter, Versager!
Mein Führer, was Sie da sagen, ist ungeheuerlich.
Die Generalität ist das Geschmeiß des deutschen Volkes!
Now we're going to I want to go through and sort of break down what I call the Baku aggression pattern, which actually led to the events of this past Sunday, what seemed to be hopeful negotiations at the start of the week ended in tragedy, because there's a pattern in the way Aliyev does his aggressions. First and foremost, there's always false reports of shooting on his positions or on his troops. Secondly, that escalates into shots being taken at Artsakh military positions or Armenian positions at the border, and specifically on civilians working their fields in Artsakh and other places or driving around their villages. So it's essentially violence against civilians. And eventually it ends and culminates into a much bigger scale of violence, which is what we saw, which was the illegal ambush of the 3 Artsakh police officers and their murders by Aliyev's gunmen. So let's look to see where all of this comes from, this aggression, I mean. In truth, the regime right now is entirely cornered on its primary demand. Its primary demand is not to open the road, or to put an illegal checkpoint on the road between Armenia and Artsakh, which is something that has never been negotiated, is in no agreement, and in fact, no one agrees to this. So the regime is in many ways cornered and is essentially lashing out, because the truth of the matter is, if they were to open this road without a checkpoint, that would be a humiliating letdown for the regime. And let's clearly understand this from Aliyev's point of view. Since September in 2020, he's essentially been on a winning streak, that in fact, that every act of aggression has had a payoff, either from the Armenian state, from the Artsakh Republic, from the Russians, or from the world community. He's actually gained by every aggression. Even during the September aggressions, even though there was it might have been a geopolitical mistake, tactically he actually gained from them by occupying parts of Armenia. So if this road opens without him having some kind of a fig leaf of a victory, this will be the beginning of reversing this winning streak that he's had since September in 2020. So in essence, this cornered regime is going to continue to lash out, and I fear that the violence against the Artsakh Republic is going to continue and escalate, and we see it in the rhetoric that's coming out of the regime. And we expect more of the same in the upcoming weeks. Now I'm going to move to personalize this attack and these murders, because it's easy to talk about three people, but we need to personalize this. The three people that were murdered by the Aliyev regime were Lieutenant Colonel Armen Babayan, Major David Danielyan, and Lieutenant Arat Gasparyan. What I want to do is I want to sit back and see who has their blood on their hands. Obviously, first and foremost, is the regime itself in Baku and its gunmen who actually carried out the murder. But they were not the only people responsible for this. After them, it's the Russian Federation. Why? Because it is not doing its job. And in fact, we know that they are part and parcel of this blockade. This blockade is a Baku-Moscow project. And if they actually wanted to open the road, they can do so in half an hour. Their soldiers would have no trouble getting rid of these regime thugs in the same way that Russian police officers get rid of police anti-war demonstrators in Moscow in short shrift. Let's move on to the other parties with blood in their hands in this case, and we'll start with the EU and US diplomats. Let's take the Toivo Klars and the Ursula von der Leyens of the world. Anybody that has spent 2 years, or the past 2 years since the war, not talking about the rights of the residents of Artsakh to live in peace and security on their own land, and more importantly, to have the right to self-determination and to defend themselves against what is a criminally inclined genocidal regime. Even worse, they have spent 2 years convincing the government in Armenia not to talk about those rights, as that is a way to the road to peace, when we all know that the issue of Artsakh and the rights of these people to live in peace on their own land is the central issue of the conflict between these two countries, and you cannot solve this conflict without putting their issues first and foremost in all of these discussions. Next, we want to move on to the international community, whether it's Davos or the Munich conference, by legitimizing this criminal regime and the gangster who runs it in Baku. There, in fact, as a matter of practical, empirical evidence, there is nothing that Vladimir Putin has done that Ilhan Aliyev has not done. So if you're not inviting Putin, then you should not be inviting Ilhan, because they have done the same things. However, I can tell you there are actually things that Ilhan Aliyev has said that Putin has never said. There are actually Ukrainians that continue to live in territories that have been occupied by Russia. Armenians are routinely murdered by the Aliyev regime in any areas controlled by the Aliyev regime. So the case can be made very easily that not only is Ilhan Aliyev as bad as Vladimir Putin, in many ways he's actually worse. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is to review the finalized economic growth numbers for 2022 that recently came out. Armenia's gross domestic product, its GDP, grew to $21 billion last year. And what the yearly growth was during last year was 12.6%. Which is the highest economic growth Armenia has recorded since independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Much of this growth was driven by booms in the finance, information technology, and transportation sectors, all of which grew by over 45%. This was combined with growth in the hospitality, construction, wholesale, retail trade, manufacturing, all of which expanded in double-digit rates. This led to the two rating agencies, Fitch and Standard & Poor's, upgrading the Armenian government's credit outlook from positive to positive from stable. And why is this important? Because based on the status that you have and the grade that you get from these rating agencies, it is how you can and at what rates can you borrow internationally. The higher you are rated, the lower your interest rates are in borrowing money internationally. Both of these rating agencies cited the Russian influx into Armenia and the billions of dollars they brought to the country, and as one of the reasons for this upward economic expansion that we've had. And they anticipate a substantial proportion of the new immigrants will actually stay in Armenia for the next couple of years. Banks in Armenia have recorded an unprecedented net flow of $2.5 billion that actually made its way into the Armenian banking system, 70% of it coming from Russia. As a result of last year's growth, Armenia's GDP per capita had reached $7,200, which is the highest this country has ever recorded. On a not much cited note, it came out that the central bank of Armenia has actually spent $900 million buying dollars in order to prevent the further appreciation of the dram. And why is that important? Is because for our exporters, an expensive dram makes their exports much more expensive internationally, and it makes imports much cheaper. In analyzing all of this, I think the Russian impact is somewhat overstated, to be honest, because we have had, since 2017, which was the last year of the old government, we have had over 5% growth in this country every single year except the 2020, which was the COVID and war years. I think what the Russian influx has done is actually to accelerate our growth from something that was going to be in the 6 to 7% range to 12%. So it's actually been a boost rather than the driving force. In conclusion, I think what's interesting to me about this Russian example is, I've been to Armenian conferences for years, and I've heard many political figures talk about, what impact would you have if suddenly 100,000, well-educated, middle-class diasporan Armenians travel and move to Armenia? Well, our Russian friends have actually given us the example of what impact that such a move could have. What it has done is not only transform the country culturally, it's also been a massive boost to our economy, taking it to another level. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
So whatever kind of action program can be devised to get us the things that are ours by right, then I'm for that kind of action no matter what the action is. I don't think when a man is being criminally treated that some criminal has the right to tell that man what tactics to use to get the criminal off his back. When a criminal starts misusing me, I am going to use whatever is necessary to get that criminal off my back. And